fixed up houses and then sold them. And the idea was, get people to move back into the city and see themselves living here and being part of the community. We found, when we were doing our strategic plan in 2018, that there was so much private sector activity in that space. We were essentially, competing against for-profit house flippers. At this point, there's enough market demand in most of our historic neighborhoods, and enough just raw cost, fixed cost in terms of materials and insurance and labor, that we were no longer really able to do that in a way that was mission aligned. What we were doing looked a lot like what the private sector was doing. But we still wanted to be doing something specifically around housing, home ownership, and the residential population of the city. So we sunset the revolving fund we had been doing, the Operation Comeback Project, and created what we call revival grants. And our revival grants fund is much more strictly charitable. It's financed through foundations. Some banks have made large donations, and various philanthropic sources. And that program just helps homeowners who live in historic districts and are at risk of getting fined from the city because of the condition of their property. Helps them make repairs to their property. One, so that their biggest investment, is in better shape and will serve them and their family longer. And two, so that the city doesn't penalize them. And oftentimes, if you're a low-income homeowner, you might want to fix up your house, but you might not have the resources. Unfortunately, our city, and I think this is true in many places in the country, really doesn't have the tools to help you fix up your house, but it does have the tools to fine you for having, a busted window or rotten siding or whatever it is. So the Revival Grants program is restricted to homeowners who make 80% of our area median income or less, and they need to live in one of those historic districts that we identified earlier. And we will make somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 worth of repairs to most of those properties. When we created the program, we really thought a lot of the fines might be more aesthetic in nature. Somebody had put in vinyl windows and they're supposed to have wood windows, or they bought a door at Home Depot and wasn't the right door for that type of house or something. What we've actually found through experience is that a lot more of them are for these citations called demolition by neglect. And usually those have some sort of visible rot on the exterior of the property, and oftentimes there's water damage on the interior of the property. So we fixed a lot of roofs, redone a lot of gutters. We replaced porch railings in some cases because it's a life safety issue. But we've helped more than a dozen families through that program so far, and hope that we'll be able to continue raising the philanthropic dollars that we then re-grant out, along with the construction management services that we provide.
So that wasn't a Katrina thing, but how did Katrina influence your guys' work, or what was the big change that it induced, or challenges, or whatever for you guys?
Yeah, I think apart from the immediate aftermath, when you have
Sure.
scattered workforce and not a lot of clarity, fortunately we were in this building at the time. This area did not flood substantially. You'll get this in your other tours, but basically the land next to the river in New Orleans is the highest land. So part of being a delta. And we had this building, so we at one time I think had almost 100 people working out of this building.
Wow.
In part of the Katrina recovery. So after that immediate shock and aftermath, there was, as you may recall, a real outpouring of national sentiment to support and help New Orleans.
We started coming.
Yeah, we had, volunteers that wanted to come and help muck out houses, and we had philanthropic entities that were willing to make sizable grants to fund rebuilding. So PRC was very active in advocating for rebuilding and advocating for people coming back. There was a massive sort of urban planning process that was born of that called Unified New Orleans Plan that we were active in from an advocacy and public policy standpoint. And then there was opportunities through that. Now, there was a lot of historic fabric that got lost, that got put in the trash, but there was opportunities to salvage buildings that were not going to be restored, to salvage historic materials from them. So for many years we had a salvage store where we would take, particularly millwork, things that are labor intensive to create, decorative brackets, shutters, doors, mantles, and windows, and we would salvage those from the structures that were going to be demolished and resell them through our salvage store. We've since, the flow of materials is much less now, so we've since kind of given that project over to another nonprofit called the Green Project. So we had our salvage store, it's located very near them, so we basically gave them our remaining stock and have kind of continued to work with them and support them in their efforts, which include not just historic decorative elements or historic lumber, but also paint recycling and a little broader building materials reuse and recycling. So that was one project that was kind of an opportunity that was created. I think there was sort of an educational aspect as well about, educating people about New Orleans all around the country. I'm quite, out there in the area where you were, there is information about all of those neighborhoods. We talked about those historic neighborhoods on the columns for you to read, and there's a brochure, some of you picked it up, for each of those historic districts. So once visitation sort of rebounded, I think PRC took on itself the role of promoting the whole city to visitors, right? You always had people who would come to the convention center, we still do, and walk to the French Quarter and stay in the CBD, and that's their total experience, right? So I think Katrina sort of opened people's eyes to the fact that there was this whole bigger city than just Bourbon Street, and so we made it part of our mission to try and drive visitation and associated spending at restaurants or shops or whatever, more citywide. And then, I think even the creation in 2016 of those largest local historic districts was in some ways part of the Katrina response, even though it's more than 10 years later. People saw both historic buildings that got flooded and restored and fixed up, and realized, oh well, plaster actually can dry out, and it's not going to grow black mold. And they also saw lots of historic buildings get knocked down, and they felt like that was change in their neighborhood. So I think a decade later there was more appetite for some constraint on the demolition of historic buildings, or increased constraint in more neighborhoods where people saw a lot of change and began to appreciate the historic stuff that did survive, right? We also have seen some neighborhoods become much more desirable and kind of, if not gentrified, at least more expensive.
By water. Yeah,
because of increased public appreciation for where they lie within the relative floodplain of the big bowl that is New Orleans. I won't overstate the role that PRC has played in it, but I think that part of the consequences of Katrina was a body of knowledge on the part of preservationists, people who work with old buildings and care about them, regarding flood risk adaptation. And now there is actually National Park Service guidance that was written in part by people who were with the Park Service or with FEMA on the ground here post-Katrina. This was released, I think, in 2018, a guidance document for owners of existing historic buildings that want to do something to prevent flooding in their structure in the future, right? Or want to see their flood insurance costs reduced. So there's a whole kind of body of best practices, least intrusive practices that were learned out of that.
Cool.